This week, global leaders descend in Hiroshima, Japan for the G7 summit. As a small club of the world's rich and powerful, the G7 represents only about 10% of the human population. Is the so-called elite group ideal for addressing global issues? Or has it become an outdated forum, no longer relevant in the 2020s? I'm Sina. Welcome to Facts Tell. Unlike larger international organizations such as the United Nations, the World Bank, and the IMF, the G7 has no permanent secretariat. A critic once said, the G7 summit is not legitimate. It's a meeting of the leaders of 7 of the strongest countries and the most dangerous.
Da sind die G7 definitiv das Hauptproblem, ebenso wie die G7 natürlich mit ihrer weltweiten Ausbeutungspolitik, mit ihrer kriegerischen Durchsetzung ihres Anspruchs, weltweit die Märkte zu kontrollieren, natürlich auch für Kriege, für Bürgerkriege und so auch der Hauptverursacher sind.
There is no formal criteria for G7 membership, but all participants are wealthy industrialized nations. Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK, and the US. Although the G7 started out with missions including providing global leadership and influencing global trends, doubts are growing about the relevance of the organization and whether it has become an artifact of a bygone era. When the grouping came about in the 1970s, it represented countries that had the largest economies. And these days? The aggregate GDP of G7 countries makes up about 45% of the global economy in nominal terms, down from nearly 70% 3 decades ago. Analysts have criticized the relevance of G7 without including growing economies like Brazil, Russia, India, and China. On top of that, all of the G7 members are also members of the G20, which actually represent 85% of global economic production and 2/3 of the world's inhabitants.
In 1975, an oil crisis, as well as lingering exchange rate turmoil caused by US President Richard Nixon decoupling the dollar from gold, prompted officials from 6 advanced economies to gather for informal talks near Paris. Those countries were Britain, France, what was then West Germany, Italy, Japan, and the United States. The next year, Canada joined the club, which officially became the Group of 7. Then the G8 when Russia later joined, and then back to the G7 again when Russia was ejected 2 years ago as a result of the crisis in Ukraine. Unlike the far more inclusive G20, the smaller club includes only one non-Western power.
The irony is that the G7 wants global problem solving, but leaves out the emerging markets and smaller countries in Asia, Africa, and South America. And the tendency of not delivering on its promises is another concern. For example, vaccine donations. Data released by NGOs shows that by last June, only less than half of the 2.1 billion COVID-19 vaccine donations promised to poorer countries by G7 countries had been delivered. If the missing doses had been shared in 2021, it could have been enough to save almost 600,000 lives in low and middle-income countries, the equivalent of 1 every minute. Also, the global food security crisis. In 2015, the G7 committed to lift 500 million people in developing countries out of hunger and malnutrition by 2030. However, by last June, the overall spending had stagnated at an average of $12 billion per year, with the G7 contribution stagnating at $7.5 billion per year. According to scientific studies, donors would need to double their contributions to achieve the goal. An additional $14 billion per year until 2030 will be needed. In contrast, just a few weeks before the food data was published, the G7 agreed to provide nearly $20 billion to fund the Ukraine crisis. The show of unity is taken for granted as a must-have at every G7 summit. Fun fact, this is also made evident in the tradition of posing for family photos. However, in recent years, more voices are questioning whether the smiles and unity are just for the cameras. In 2018, the summit was marked by sharp disagreements over former U.S. President Donald Trump's decision to impose higher import taxes. You may still remember this photo, which was trending all over social media and telling it all about tensions at the event. Trump later said he would instruct U.S. officials not to endorse the G7 statement, which was another monumental moment. And 1 year later, in 2019, the summit ended without issuing a full-length joint communique for the first time in history. To make matters worse, in 2021, when the summit was being aired, the disagreements among the leaders at one point became so sensitive that all internet was shut off to the room. And then this year, before the leaders' summit, ministers from member states already felt that Japan's earlier expectations for G7 endorsement of its latest wastewater discharge plan with restrained expressions.
Regarding the discharge of contaminated water from Fukushima nuclear power plant into the sea, the statement also expressed support for the safety verification of the IAEA. However, according to Japan's Asahi Shimbun, the phrase welcomed the release of contaminated water that the Japanese government wanted was not included in the statement. This is due to opposition from Germany's environment minister.
What started out as an informal annual summit of highly developed economies has become self-defeating. The internal division within G7 shows that not all like-minded countries are of the same mind. So the question is, can we still trust them to solve global problems of their own making? Alright, that's all we have today. Thanks for watching. If you like our show, please remember to click like and subscribe. I'm Sina. I'll see you next time.